My name is Patricia Morrison. I'm 63 years old. And the morning my daughter-in-law told me to leave my own home, I was standing barefoot on my balcony, watching the Atlantic roll in like it had done every day long before she ever entered my life. The condo was quiet, the kind of quiet you earn after decades of work. The sliding doors were open, letting in the salt air. My coffee sat untouched on the small table beside me, already going cold. For the first time in months, my mind wasn't racing. I felt settled, grounded. Then my phone rang. Vanessa's name lit up the screen. My daughter-in-law. I answered without thinking much of it. I expected something ordinary. A question, a courtesy call, maybe even a thank you for letting them use the place occasionally. Her voice came through tight and rushed. Patricia, my parents just got here. I waited. The ocean filled the silence while I stood there, confused, listening for the rest of the sentence. They're staying at the condo, she said. So it would be better if you went to a hotel for a few days. They need privacy. I laughed softly at first, not because it was funny, but because my brain refused to process what I had just heard. I looked around the balcony, the furniture I picked out myself, the railings I had paid to replace, the home I had bought alone long after raising my son on my own. She didn't pause. She didn't apologize. You're not very demanding anyway, she added. And honestly, this place will be Marcus's someday, so it's basically ours. That was the moment something shifted inside me. Not anger, not tears, just a quiet, heavy realization. I had stopped being a person to her. I was a temporary inconvenience. I tightened my grip on the phone and answered calmly. All right, I said. I'll be out in an hour. Vanessa thanked me like I'd done her a favor. She thought that call ended the situation. Didn't. The taxi ride felt longer than it was. I watched familiar streets pass by through the window, the palm trees blurring together, my reflection faintly visible in the glass. I looked calm on the outside. Anyone watching would have assumed I was just another older woman heading to a short-term stay somewhere modest. Inside, my thoughts were sharp and painfully clear. This wasn't about space. It wasn't about privacy. It was about entitlement. I checked into the motel with my driver's license and a credit card I'd earned the right to use decades ago. The young woman behind the counter smiled politely and handed me a key card. She didn't know who I was. She didn't need to. For the first time in hours, that anonymity felt like relief. The room was small but clean. A bed, a desk, a single window facing the parking lot. I set my suitcase down and stood there for a moment, listening to the hum of the air conditioner. It rattled slightly, like it had a story of its own to tell. I sat on the bed and finally allowed myself to breathe. What hurt wasn't losing the condo for a few days. I could afford a hotel. I could afford 10 hotels if I wanted. What hurt was how easily Vanessa had erased me. How quickly my presence had become inconvenient. How casually she spoke about my home as if it were already hers. And what hurt even more was Marcus's silence. I raised him alone. His father left when he was barely 2 years old. I worked overtime shifts, missed holidays, wore the same winter coat for 10 years so he could have new shoes. I never once made him feel like he owed me anything. And now, standing in that motel room, I wondered when my quiet strength had been mistaken for weakness. My phone buzzed. A message from Vanessa. Asterisk, do you know where the extra linens are? Also, my mom is asking about the utility bills and Wi-Fi password. Asterisk. I stared at the screen for a long moment. The audacity of it was almost impressive. Less than 2 hours after pushing me out, she was already treating me like the help. I didn't reply right away. Instead, I opened social media. Another post. Judith on the balcony, wine glass raised. Richard commenting about how lucky they were to have such a beautiful place to gather as a family. Family. The word sat heavy in my chest. I thought about all the dinners I had hosted there, the birthdays, the Thanksgivings, the effort I put into making that space warm and welcoming. I had believed that generosity would build respect. I was wrong. Still, I didn't comment. I didn't call. I didn't correct anyone publicly. I replied to Vanessa's message a few minutes later, keeping my tone neutral. I'll send what I have later. Later meant when I was ready. I spent the rest of the afternoon walking along a public stretch of beach near the motel. It wasn't as quiet as the one outside my condo. Children ran past me. Vendors shouted. Radios played too loudly. But the ocean was the same ocean. It didn't belong to anyone. I sat on the sand and let the sun warm my face. I thought about how many times in my life I had stayed quiet to keep the peace. How often I had swallowed discomfort to avoid conflict. How many little slights I had dismissed because confronting them felt exhausting. I realized something then. Silence doesn't keep the peace. It only delays the reckoning. When I returned to the motel that evening, my phone had several missed calls from Marcus. I listened to his voicemail without answering. Mom, Vanessa didn't mean it the way it sounded. Her parents are just used to certain things. Can we talk? Closed my eyes. Used to certain things. I wondered if that included pushing older women aside when they were no longer useful. I didn't call him back that night, not because I was angry, but because I needed him to sit with the discomfort he'd helped create. Before bed, I opened my laptop and reviewed the screenshots I had taken. The captions, the comments, the casual claims of ownership. I saved everything in a folder labeled simply with the date. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do yet, but I knew one thing for sure. I was done shrinking myself to make other people comfortable. As I turned off the lamp and lay back on the motel bed, the air conditioner rattling softly above me, I felt something unexpected settle in. Not fear. Resolve. And that was the moment I stopped being the woman Vanessa thought she could move out of the way. I woke up the next morning before my alarm, the pale motel light filtering through the thin curtains. For a few seconds, I didn't remember where I was. Then the events of the day before settled back into place, heavy but sharp, like a truth that refused to be ignored. I made a cup of weak motel coffee and sat at the small desk by the window. Outside, cars came and went. People moved on with their routines. The world hadn't stopped just because my sense of security had been shaken. My phone buzzed again. Another message from Vanessa. *, we moved some of your things into the storage closet so my parents would be more comfortable. Hope that's okay. *. I stared at the words, my fingers tightening around the phone. She hadn't asked. She hadn't waited. She had already decided. I imagined strangers opening my closets, touching my clothes, deciding what belonged in sight and what should be hidden away. The violation wasn't dramatic, but it was deeply personal. It was the kind of disrespect that came from believing someone else's space was yours to manage. I didn't respond. Instead, I opened social media again. There were more photos now. Judith sitting at my dining table. Richard standing in my kitchen, pointing toward a wall. His mouth mid-sentence as if he were explaining something important. Vanessa had captioned it. So many ideas for updates already. Dates. They were planning changes, not decorations. Changes. I took screenshots of everything. Every caption, every comment, every careless word that suggested ownership. I didn't rush. I made sure each image was clear, each date visible. This wasn't about revenge. It was about reality. Late that morning I finally called David Walsh. David had been my attorney for years. Not because I was litigious, but because I believed in being prepared. We had gone to college together before life took us in different directions. He knew my history. He knew my temperament. Most importantly, he knew I didn't make impulsive decisions. "Patricia," he said when he answered. "You don't usually call this early. Everything okay?" I told him exactly what had happened. I didn't exaggerate. I didn't soften it either. I repeated Vanessa's words as clearly as I remembered them. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "She told you to leave your own property," he said slowly. "Yes. And she's letting other people stay there as if they have rights to it." "Yes." David exhaled. "All right. Let's be very clear about something first. No one can force you out of your own home. Not your son, not your daughter-in-law, not her parents." "I know," I said. "But knowing that and stopping what's happening are two different things." "You're right," he replied. "So here's what we do. We don't escalate emotionally. We document. We stay calm and we make sure that when you speak, it's with facts, not frustration. That was exactly what I needed to hear. I emailed him the screenshots, all of them. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he called me back an hour later. They're presenting themselves publicly as owners, he said. That matters, especially if they start making changes or claiming long-term use. So what's my next step? You wait, he said. And you let them keep talking. Waiting had never been my favorite thing. I was a woman who had solved problems her entire life by working harder, pushing through, handling things quietly. But this time waiting wasn't passive. It was strategic. That afternoon Marcus finally called again. Answered. Mom, he said quickly. Things got a little out of hand. Vanessa's parents are just excited. Can we talk later? Later is fine, I said calmly. There was a hesitation on the line. You're not upset, are you? I looked at the motel wall, the faded artwork, the unfamiliar space I had been pushed into. I'm paying attention, I said. There's a difference. He didn't know how to respond to that. After we hung up, I sat quietly for a long time. I thought about all the moments I had dismissed over the years. The comments about my clothes, the jokes about my age, the way Vanessa spoke over me at family dinners. None of it had been accidental. That evening, Vanessa sent another message. Asterisk, my parents might stay longer than expected. Just letting you know. Asterisk. I smiled for the first time since this began. Stay longer. The more comfortable they became pretending the condo was theirs, the clearer everything would be when the truth finally arrived. I closed my laptop, turned off my phone, and lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling. I didn't feel powerless anymore. I felt prepared. And preparation, I had learned over a lifetime, was far more dangerous than anger. The next morning I took my time getting dressed, not because I wanted to look impressive, but because I needed to feel steady. I chose clothes I would normally wear to meet an old friend or handle important paperwork. Nothing dramatic, nothing defensive, just myself. David picked me up outside the motel a little before 10 o'clock. The drive back to the condo was quiet. I watched the familiar streets pass by, noticing how ordinary everything looked. It struck me then how easily life keeps moving, even when something important is breaking underneath the surface. When we arrived, the parking lot told me everything I needed to know. There were more cars than usual, beach towels draped over open trunks, a cooler near the entrance, signs that people had settled in, not as guests but as if they belonged. The elevator ride felt longer than the one 2 days earlier. I could hear voices before the doors even opened. Laughter, music, the sound of glasses clinking together, the kind of noise people make when they feel comfortable, when they assume they're safe. David glanced at me as the door slid open. You don't have to say much, he said quietly. I know, I replied. I've already said everything I needed to. He rang the doorbell. The music stopped abruptly. Footsteps approached. When the door opened, Vanessa stood there with a drink in her hand, her smile fading the moment she saw me. Her eyes flicked to David, then back to me. What are you doing here? She asked. I didn't answer her. I stepped past her and into the condo. It looked different. Not rearranged exactly, but altered in subtle ways. Furniture shifted. My personal items pushed aside. A feeling of occupation hung in the air. Quiet but unmistakable. Judith and Richard stood up from the couch, clearly surprised. Marcus was near the kitchen island, his face tense, his posture stiff. Mom, he said softly. We weren't expecting you back today. I didn't say I was gone, I replied. David closed the door behind us and set his briefcase on the dining table. The sound was small, but it changed the atmosphere immediately. This was no longer a misunderstanding. This was a conversation with consequences. Vanessa recovered quickly. This is unnecessary, she said. We're just spending time together. You could have called first. I did call, I said. You told me to leave. Judith stepped forward, uncertainty written across her face. Patricia, dear, we had no idea this would cause tension. Vanessa told us this place was part of their future. David opened his briefcase slowly and removed a folder. That appears to be where the confusion started, he said calmly. This condo is legally owned by Patricia Morrison. Sole ownership. No shared title. No agreement for future transfer. Judith frowned. But Vanessa said. Vanessa cut her off. I said it was understood. Marcus will inherit it someday. David met her gaze. Someday is not a legal arrangement. Marcus shifted uncomfortably. Vanessa, you told your parents Mom agreed to this. Vanessa turned toward him, irritation flashing across her face. You know how your mother is. She doesn't need all this space. I felt something tighten in my chest, but my voice stayed steady. This space is mine. Judith looked at me directly. Patricia, did you promise to give them this condo? No, I said. I never did. The silence that followed was heavy. Richard crossed his arms, his jaw tightening. Then why are we here? Because your daughter invited you, I replied. And told you things that weren't true. Vanessa laughed sharply. This is being blown out of proportion. David reached into his briefcase again and placed several printed pages on the table. These are public posts referring to the condo as ours, plans for renovations, statements implying ownership, all documented. Judith picked one up, her hands trembling slightly as she read. Her expression shifted from confusion to disbelief. You told us this place was basically yours, she said quietly, looking at Vanessa. Vanessa didn't respond. Marcus looked down at the floor. David spoke again. At this point, Patricia is formally asking anyone without her permission to vacate the property. Vanessa's face flushed. You can't be serious. I am, I said. This is my home. Judith stood abruptly, her face pale. Richard, we're leaving. Vanessa turned to her in disbelief. Mom, no. This is not how we raised you, Judith said, her voice shaking. We were misled. Richard picked up their bags without another word. As they moved toward the door, Judith paused in front of me. I'm sorry, she said. We truly didn't know. I believe you, I replied. When they left, the room felt suddenly smaller. Vanessa turned to me, her eyes sharp with anger. This isn't over. I met her gaze without flinching. No, I said. It isn't. And for the first time since this began, I saw uncertainty replace her confidence. After Judith and Richard left, the condo fell into a silence that felt heavier than noise. The music Vanessa had been playing earlier remained paused. Half-empty glasses sat untouched on the counter. The air felt unsettled, like a room that had just witnessed something it couldn't forget. Vanessa stood near the center of the living room, her arms folded tightly across her chest. The certainty she had carried so effortlessly before was gone. In its place was something brittle, defensive. Marcus hadn't moved from the kitchen island. He stared at the floor, his shoulders slumped, as if the weight of everything he had avoided was finally pressing down on him. David calmly gathered the documents from the dining table. His movements were unhurried, professional. When he looked at me, his expression was steady. Are you all right? He asked quietly. I am, I replied. And for the first time since this began, I meant it. He nodded once and turned toward Vanessa. You'll need to gather your personal belongings and leave the property today. Any remaining items can be arranged later through appropriate channels. Vanessa let out a short, incredulous laugh. You're acting like I'm a stranger here. David didn't respond. He didn't need to. Marcus finally lifted his head. Vanessa, he said, his voice low. We need to talk. Not now, she snapped. This is between me and your mother. No, he said, surprising both of us. It's between us. David excused himself and stepped out onto the balcony, closing the door behind him. The sound of the waves filtered in, steady and indifferent. A reminder that the world outside this room continued on its own terms. Vanessa turned toward Marcus, frustration spilling over. Are you really going to let her do this? She's turning this into something it doesn't have to be. Marcus rubbed his face with both hands. You told your parents this condo was basically ours. She hesitated just for a moment. I told them what made sense. What made sense for who? He asked. The question lingered unanswered. I watched my son carefully then. Not as a mother desperate to protect him, but as someone seeing him clearly for the first time in a long while. He wasn't angry. He wasn't dramatic. He looked tired, disappointed, awake. Vanessa shifted her focus to me, her tone sharpening. You don't even use this place that much. That doesn't make it yours, I replied calmly. Marcus exhaled slowly. Vanessa, you should go stay with your parents. Her eyes widened. You're choosing her over me. I'm choosing honesty, he said. And I'm choosing not to pretend this didn't happen. For a moment, it looked like she might argue, might cry, might try to pull him back with emotion. Instead, she shook her head and grabbed her bag. This isn't over, she said again, though the words lacked the confidence they once had. When the door closed behind her, the silence shifted. No longer felt heavy. Felt real. Marcus sank onto the couch and covered his face with his hands. I'm sorry, Mom, he said quietly. I should have stopped this earlier. I sat beside him and placed my hand on his shoulder. You didn't create this situation, I said gently. But you are responsible for what you do next. He nodded slowly. I didn't want conflict. I thought if I stayed quiet, things would smooth over. They rarely do, I replied. David returned a few minutes later, giving Marcus a brief nod. I'll be in touch if anything else is needed, he said. But for now, the matter is settled. After he left, Marcus and I stayed in the condo together, not talking much, just moving quietly through the space. We returned furniture to where it belonged, put my things back in place, opened the windows wide to let the sea air circulate. As the afternoon stretched into evening, the condo began to feel like mine again. Not because of the furniture or the walls, but because I was no longer questioning whether I had the right to be there. When the sun started to dip, Marcus joined me on the balcony. The sky burned orange and pink, the water below catching the light in long, slow ripples. I didn't realize how much I'd been ignoring, he said softly. Not just with Vanessa. With you. I watched the horizon. We all ignore things until they demand our attention. He nodded. I don't know what happens next. That's all right, I said. You don't need all the answers today. That night, after Marcus went to bed, I sat alone in the living room. The condo was quiet again, but this time the silence felt earned. Honest. I thought about how often kindness is mistaken for permission. How silence is mistaken for agreement. How women my age are expected to step aside quietly, to make room without complaint, as if our needs diminish with time. I didn't feel triumphant. Felt settled. This hadn't been about winning. It had been about refusing to disappear. The next morning, sunlight filled the condo. I made coffee in my own kitchen and stepped barefoot onto the balcony once more. The ocean looked the same as it always had. The difference was me. I had learned that protecting your boundaries doesn't make you unkind. It makes you truthful. And truth, even when it disrupts the peace, is the only thing that restores it in the end. The condo was still mine. But more importantly, so was my voice.